together to try to bring him to justice.
Carlie's father, Joe Brucia, is furious.
Your girl Carlie Brucia has been found.
Was caught a man approaching and leading.
On the evening of February 1st, 2004, 11-year-old Carlie left a friend's house in Sarasota, Florida, with one simple plan: get home in time for the Super Bowl. The walk was familiar. The neighborhood was safe, or at least it felt that way. She had made similar walks before, and her family was close by, waiting for her. She never arrived, and within days, her face would appear on television screens in every corner of America. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what had been done to her. Her full name was Carlie Jane Brucia. She was born on March 16, 1992, in Nassau County, New York, specifically in Oyster Bay on Long Island, the daughter of Susan Nancy Shorpin and Joseph Brucia, Jr. By 1993, when Carlie was barely a year old, her parents had divorced. Her mother eventually relocated to Sarasota, Florida, and in the mid-1990s, and it was in that warm coastal city that Carlie grew up. Her father, Joe Brucia, remained in New York, and by the time Carlie was 11, she saw him only twice a year, during summer and winter school breaks. It was a distance that clearly weighed on him, though neither of them could have imagined how brutally it would be made permanent. Carlie lived in Sarasota with her mother, Susan, her stepfather, Stephen Kanzler, a 6-year-old half-brother named Leaf, and a 10-year-old stepbrother. She also had a cat named Charlie, a small, domestic detail that somehow speaks volumes about the ordinary, full life she was living. She was a child, surrounded by family, by school friends, by the texture of everyday childhood. By February 2004, Carlie was 11 years old and in 6th grade at McIntosh Middle School in Sarasota. She was, by every account from those who knew her, a Renaissance student, a designation given to students at McIntosh who maintained a grade point average of 3.0 or above. She was not just coasting through school. She was engaged, curious, and performing well academically in an environment where many her age were already beginning to drift. What her teachers and classmates remember most, though, is not her grades. It is her personality. Carlie was vivacious. She loved pizza, Jennifer Lopez, and singing in the McIntosh Middle School chorus. She dreamed of being a pop star. She loved roller skating, hanging out with friends, and admired singers like Jennifer Lopez and rappers Nelly and 50 Cent. These were the enthusiasms of a completely normal 11-year-old girl in 2004, a child of her time, plugged into pop culture, and vibrant and full of opinions. Her personality was versatile and expressive. According to family friend Teresa Baccara, if she wanted to be a little gothic one day, she'd wear black. Next day, she would be in little pigtails and capris. She was not a girl who fit neatly into one box. She changed with her mood, experimented with who she was, and that in itself was a sign of a healthy, developing young person still figuring out the world. She was also, by all accounts, unusually kind for her age. In the gossip-filled hallways of middle school, she was never heard to badmouth anyone. She was a friend even to the younger kids that others her age might have ignored. That quality, the instinct to include rather than exclude, is one that many adults spend a lifetime trying to develop. Carlie had it naturally at 11. And friends remembered her as someone who always shared warm hugs, respected her parents and teachers, and loved music, close friend Tiffany Meeks later told reporters. She was loving and caring. She doesn't like to see other people hurt. Family friend Chessie Huber described Carlie as very responsible, not the type of child who would just go off. This detail matters more than it might seem, because in the days that followed her disappearance, people would struggle to understand how a girl so street smart, so aware, so unlikely to trust a stranger had been taken. The answer, ultimately, had nothing to do with naivety or carelessness. It had everything to do with the calculating nature of the man who took her. Those who knew Carlie best described her as wise beyond her years and unlikely to trust a stranger. She was not sheltered or unaware of the world. On the very morning of February 1st, 2004, the last full day she was alive, she had breakfast at McDonald's with Ron Choquette, a family friend. At breakfast, Carlie became upset because some men were looking at her. Choquette told her not to let it bother her, recalling, "I told her they're going to do that." Carlie responded that boys were always doing that to her. This moment is heartbreaking in retrospect. An 11-year-old girl already navigating the uncomfortable reality of unwanted male attention, trying to process it over a meal on a Sunday morning. She was sharp enough to notice it, confident enough to voice her discomfort, and wise enough to seek reassurance from a trusted adult. She was not oblivious to danger. She was simply not given the chance to escape it. Carlie's friend, Samantha Riley, later recalled that the Friday before she disappeared, the two of them had talked about Carlie's Sweet 16 and what they were going to do to celebrate it. She was 4.5 years away from that birthday. She was planning for a future. She had every reason to believe she would have one. Cadence Stauffer, 11 years old, and one of Carlie's classmates, later told reporters, "You never know what he said to her. For all you know, he could have had a gun and threatened to kill her." Even the children around Carlie understood instinctively that their friend would not have gone willingly. And they knew her. Carlie's family situation was, like many American families, complicated by divorce, geography, and the particular strains of blended households. Her mother, Susan, was loving but struggling. Her father, Joe, was present in her heart, even when geography kept him physically distant. Her stepfather, Stephen Conzler, was part of her daily life, driving her places, looking out for her in the way that step-parents do, imperfectly, humanly, with the ordinary lapses that no one imagines will ever matter. That Sunday evening, Carlie had been staying overnight at a friend's house. Around 6:10 p.m., her friend's mother, Connie, called Susan to let her know Carlie was on her way home on foot. It was a 1-mile walk, a distance that, in a quiet Florida neighborhood on a Sunday evening, it would have seemed entirely manageable for a responsible 11-year-old. Her stepfather, Stephen, drove the route to intercept her and give her a lift, but he missed her by just a couple of minutes. Just a couple of minutes. The cruelty of that timing is almost impossible to sit with. Only 30 minutes after she vanished, her worried parents reported Carlie's disappearance to authorities. They knew immediately something was wrong. This was not a child who wandered. This was not a child who disappeared without reason. Her parents knew that the moment she didn't walk through the door. Sarasota, Florida, in 2004, was a mid-sized Gulf Coast city, known for its art scene, its white sand beaches, and its reputation as a pleasant, relatively safe place to raise a family. Bee Ridge Road, the stretch where Carlie walked that evening, was a busy, a well-traveled corridor. It was not a dark alley. It was not a hidden corner of the city. It was an ordinary road in an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary Sunday evening. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of what was about to happen. It occurred in plain sight. Carlie had taken a shortcut behind Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road, a route that security cameras happened to cover. At approximately 6:20 p.m., surveillance footage captured Carlie cutting in front of the car wash. It was the last time she would be seen alive. Somewhere on that familiar route between her friend's house and her own front door, a man was waiting. Not for her specifically, not by any plan that had been laid in advance, but he was there. And in the span of a few seconds, everything changed. Carlie Jane Brucia, the girl who loved Jennifer Lopez, who sang in the school chorus, who planned her Sweet 16, who gave warm hugs to everyone she met, was gone, and no one yet knew why. While Carlie was singing in the school chorus and planning her Sweet 16, a man was unraveling, not dramatically, not in any way that the people around him could have fully understood in the moment. But the destruction was happening, slowly, then all at once, in the background of a life that had never quite found solid ground. By the evening of February 1st, 2004, that unraveling had reached its most dangerous point, and Carlie Jane Brucia was about to walk into the path of it. His full name was Joseph Peter Smith. He was born on March 17, 1966, exactly one day after Carlie Brucia would be born 26 years later. He was 37 years old on the night he took her. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, Dave Smith was a tattooed, heavy-set man who had worked as an auto mechanic and was, by the time of the crime, unemployed. He was also, on paper, a father. He had 3 children of his own. That detail is worth holding on to, not to generate sympathy, but to underscore something important. Joseph Smith did not look like the monster people imagine when they think of child predators. He looked like a working-class man from New York who fixed cars for a living. He had a family. He attended holiday barbecues. He walked dogs with his teenage niece. He was hiding in plain sight, not through any sophisticated deception, but simply because evil rarely announces itself in advance. Smith had originally come from Brooklyn, and records indicate he had relocated to Florida at some point before the crime, and the documented record of his early childhood is limited in public sources. But what is clear is that by the time he reached adulthood, his life had already been shaped by a decade of addiction. At his sentencing hearing, Smith himself told the court that he had been a heroin addict since the age of 19 and had unsuccessfully tried to quit several times. That means that for nearly 2 decades, from his late teens through his late 30s, Joseph Smith's life had been organized, at least in part, around the gravitational pull of substance dependency. Everything else, jobs, relationships, legal standing, rotated around that core instability. What makes this case so painful, beyond the tragedy of Carlie herself, is the documented paper trail that preceded February 1st, 2004. Joseph Smith was not unknown to law enforcement. He was not a man who had slipped through the cracks unnoticed. He was a man who had been noticed, charged, processed, and released again and again, while a ticking clock counted down. Before Carlie's murder, Smith had been arrested at least 13 times since 1993, mostly on drug offenses. 13 arrests in 11 years. That is more than 1 arrest per year on average. A sustained, documented pattern of criminal behavior that the legal system had repeatedly failed to interrupt with any lasting consequence. The arrests were predominantly narcotics-related, but they were not limited to drugs. In one earlier case, Smith had been charged with kidnapping a 20-year-old woman, but was acquitted. He had also pleaded no contest in a separate case in which a woman said he hit her in the face with a motorcycle helmet, for which he was sentenced to 60 days in jail. He also served 17 months in prison on drug possession and fraud charges. Read that again. Joseph Smith had previously been charged with kidnapping. He had previously been accused of violence against a woman. He had served time in prison. And yet, by February 2004, he was walking free, on probation, yes, but free, in a residential neighborhood in Sarasota, Florida. Smith was on probation at the time of Carlie's murder, having been released from state prison 13 months prior. His probation terms required him to stay clean and to meet financial obligations, including $411 in court fines. He had failed to pay those fines. A judge had been made aware of this violation. The judge declined to revoke his probation, noting that Florida does not have a debtor's prison, a technicality, a missed opportunity, a decision that, in retrospect, cost an 11-year-old girl her life. In the weeks leading up to February 1st, 2004, Joseph Smith's life had fully collapsed around him. After a decade as an on-again, off-again addict, Smith's drug habit was very much on again. As a result of his latest relapse, he had been run out of his home in North Sarasota by his wife and fired from his job as an auto mechanic. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his employment. He had no stable address. He was staying with friends, borrowing their car to move around the city. Smith was flopping with friends who had loaned him their car, a 12-year-old Buick, so he could score his fix. That Buick, a yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon, would later become one of the most critical pieces of physical evidence in the investigation. But on the evening of February 1st, it was simply the borrowed vehicle of a man with nowhere left to go. At his sentencing hearing, Smith told the court that on the day of the crime, he had taken large amounts of cocaine and heroin in hopes of killing himself. This claim, that he intended to overdose that day, was presented by his defense team as context for his mental state. Whether it was true or a calculated attempt to generate sympathy, what it reveals is that by the afternoon of Super Bowl Sunday 2004, Joseph Smith believed his own life was over. He was a man in total freefall. He found himself sitting in the borrowed Buick at approximately 6:15 p.m. on Bee Ridge Road, alone with his cocaine, as the rest of the country gathered around television sets for the Super Bowl kickoff. Smith had nowhere to go in life. As a parolee, he understood that his relapse made a return to prison likely. This is the picture of the man who would encounter Carlie Brucia in a matter of minutes, chemically impaired, homeless by circumstance, legally cornered, emotionally destroyed. Not a calculated predator who had planned this crime for weeks. Something, perhaps, more terrifying. A man with nothing left to lose and no remaining internal mechanism to stop himself. One of the small, almost absurd details of this case is that Joseph Smith was wearing his gray mechanic's uniform on the evening of February 1st, complete with a name tag patch on the chest that read Joe. He had left the home of his friend Jeff that afternoon wearing that uniform. He had not changed. When he appeared on the car wash surveillance footage within hours, the mechanic's shirt, the name tag, and the tattoos covering his arms would make him one of the most identifiable suspects in the history of Florida crime coverage. After detectives were granted consent to search his room and belongings, they found 2 gray uniforms with a yellow Joe name tag in his closet. The very shirt he wore during the abduction was sitting in a closet, apparently unwashed, while investigators combed the city for Carlie. The tattoos on his arms were similarly visible in the footage, clear enough that people who knew Joseph Smith personally recognized him when the video was broadcast on national television. At least 2 informants called police after recognizing Smith from the television broadcasts of the security camera footage. His own social circle identified him. His own community turned him in. Even those who knew him, who had shared meals with him, walked dogs with him, trusted him near their families, recognized the man in that footage and made the call. Among the most significant figures in this case is John Smith, Joseph's brother. John would later become a key witness for the prosecution, and his testimony would prove devastating to the defense. But in the immediate aftermath of the crime, John was placed in an almost unbearable position. The brother of a man the entire country was hunting, a man who had confessed to him personally. According to John's account, Joseph initially said to him, "I'm sorry I did this to you." After their mother left the room, Joseph told John that on the night of the crime, he had ingested what he believed was cocaine, and that everything afterward was a blur. John later told investigators that it felt like Joseph was afraid to say outright that Carlie was dead. John recalled saying, "Okay, Joe, she's dead. Fine. Where is she? We gotta find her. Where is she?" It was only then that Smith revealed Carlie was in a field near a church on Proctor Road. That conversation, a brother extracting a confession, a location, a truth, is one of the most haunting exchanges in this entire case. And it raises a question that lingers. What kind of man confesses to his brother before he tells investigators where the body is? The answer is a man who understood on some level that what he had done was irreversible. A man who was not so impaired that he lacked awareness. A man who had made choices. By 6:15 p.m. on February 1st, 2004, Joseph Smith was parked in a borrowed yellow Buick on Bee Ridge Road, impaired, directionless, and cornered by his own accumulated failures. Less than a mile away, Carlie Brucia was lacing up her shoes at her friend's house, grabbing her pink backpack, and stepping out into the early evening air to walk home. She had no idea the man in the Buick existed. He had no idea she was coming. And yet, within minutes, their paths would intersect at the back of Evie's car wash, and the world would never be the same for anyone connected to either of them. The surveillance camera was already recording. There are moments in history that a camera captures by accident, images no one planned to record, that no one anticipated would matter. The footage from Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road in Sarasota, Florida, on the evening of February 1st, 2004, is one of those moments. 71 seconds, grainy, black and white, and yet burned into the memory of an entire nation. What it shows is not graphic. It does not show violence. What it shows is something in some ways more disturbing. A little girl walking alone, and then a man reaching out and taking her, as casually, as unhurriedly, as if he had every right in the world. The date was February 1st, 2004. Super Bowl 38 was hours away. The New England Patriots facing the Carolina Panthers in Houston, Texas. Across America, families were gathering. Chips were being opened. Televisions were warming up. In Sarasota, Florida, an 11-year-old girl was preparing to do exactly the same thing. Carlie had been sleeping over at a friend's house and was headed home to watch the Super Bowl that evening. It was an ordinary plan. a completely unremarkable Sunday evening objective for a sixth grader. She wanted to be home with her family, watching the game, eating snacks, doing what millions of American kids were doing that night. Carlie left the Sarasota home of her friend between 6:10 and 6:15 p.m. to walk home. The distance was approximately 1 mile, a route she was familiar with through a neighborhood she knew. Before she left, her friend's mother called Susan Shorpen to let her know Carlie was on her way. Susan, in turn, asked her husband, Stephen Kanzler, to drive out and pick Carlie up. He went. He drove the route. He missed her by just a couple of minutes at the most. Those minutes are the fault line of this entire story. Not negligence, not carelessness, just the brutal arithmetic of timing, the kind that no parent, no stepfather, and no family could have anticipated or controlled. Carlie had taken a shortcut, a path behind Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road, a route that cut across the back of the property. It was the kind of shortcut kids take instinctively, shaving distance off a familiar walk. The car wash was closed for the evening. The parking lot was quiet. What Carlie could not have known was that the car wash's security camera was still running, and that a yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon was parked nearby, its driver watching. At around 6:20 p.m., surveillance footage captured Carlie cutting behind Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road. The footage shows her walking with her pink backpack, unhurried, unsuspecting. Then a figure appears, a heavy-set man in a gray mechanic shirt, tattoos visible on his arms, approaches her, and there is a brief exchange, seconds, nothing more. Then the man reaches out, takes her by the wrist, and guides her away from the camera's frame toward a waiting vehicle. Carlie does not run. She does not scream, at least not in any way the camera captures. Family friend Chessie Huber, who studied the footage carefully, said, "If you look at Carlie's face, she's shocked. Her life had to be threatened." Her father, Joe Brucia, who watched the same footage and later appeared on national television, said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He told ABC News, "Take a good look at my daughter. Look at her face. If she knew him and wanted to be with him, there would be a big smile on that face. There was no smile. There was shock. And then she was gone from the frame. The entire sequence lasted approximately 71 seconds. What followed those 71 seconds is documented through court records, forensic evidence, and the confession Joseph Smith made to his brother John, a confession that investigators later used to locate Carlie's body. Smith took Carlie to a location away from the car wash in the borrowed yellow Buick. According to court and medical records, Carlie was sexually assaulted while she was still alive. She was then strangled from behind. The Sarasota County Medical Examiner determined strangulation as her cause of death, with a ligature mark prominent on her neck. Abrasions on the side of her body indicated she had been dragged to her final resting place. She was 11 years old. She had left a friend's house to watch a football game. Then Smith disposed of Carlie's backpack and clothing in different trash bins. The pink backpack she had been wearing, a detail her family and classmates would remember, was discarded like refuse, scattered across separate dumpsters in an attempt to destroy evidence. An encrypted letter Smith later wrote to his brother, decoded by an FBI cryptanalyst during trial, confirmed this. The decoded message read in part that the backpack and clothes had gone into 4 different dumpsters, and that he had dragged the body to where it was found. He then drove the Buick back to his friend Jeff's house, returning it in the early morning hours of February 2nd. Jeff later told police that Smith had borrowed the car that day and didn't return until around 7:30 a.m. on February 2nd. He was still wearing his gray mechanic's uniform when he left home, and when he returned, things inside the car were out of place, and Smith was acting strangely. Carlie's body had been left in a field behind the Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road, not far from where she was taken, hidden but not far, close enough that the entire search, the entire 5-day ordeal of her family's hope and agony, was playing out within miles of where she lay. Only 30 minutes after Carlie vanished, her worried parents reported her disappearance to authorities. Investigators launched a missing persons investigation immediately. They brought bloodhounds to the area. The dogs tracked Carlie's scent to the car wash on Bee Ridge Road, but lost it on a side street. A shortcut to her home? The trail went cold at the point where she had been taken by vehicle. The scent simply stopped because she had been put into a car and driven away. Then investigators reviewed the car wash security footage and everything changed. The grainy black and white video of a man in a mechanic's shirt leading a little girl by the wrist was released to the public on February 3rd. Its release sparked a massive search and media coverage that swept the entire nation. It aired on every major network. It was shown on the morning news shows and the evening broadcasts. NASA was reportedly brought in to attempt to enhance the image quality of the footage. The FBI assigned agents to the case. Hundreds of leads poured in. The Sarasota community, and then the entire country, held its breath. Carlie's father, Joe, appeared on NBC's Today Show. He addressed her abductor directly on air. To the man who abducted her, "When you've done a considerable amount of damage, please stop. Release my daughter. Let her go. With some help and some love she can heal. Give us back our daughter." Her mother, Susan, barely able to speak, added, "We desperately need her. Please release Carlie. Please give me my baby." Those appeals went unanswered. The man they were speaking to was already in custody for something else entirely, and saying nothing. Smith was already in custody by February 3rd, having been arrested on an unrelated parole violation. At least 2 people who had seen the car wash footage on television called authorities to identify him. People from his own community, people who knew him. After detectives were granted consent to search his belongings, they found the gray mechanic's uniforms with the Joe name tag. Drug paraphernalia in his car confirmed the parole violation. He was brought in. Smith refused to speak about Carlie. For 2 days, he said nothing. Investigators had the footage. They had the tips. They had the physical evidence beginning to build. But they did not yet know where she was. It was not until February 5th that Smith finally revealed where he had hidden Carlie's body, behind a nearby church. The information came after his brother John, in a devastating act of moral courage, told investigators what Joseph had confessed to him. Faced with that, faced with the weight of what his brother had revealed, Smith directed police to Proctor Road. In a field behind the Central Church of Christ, Carlie Brucia was found lying on her back. She was naked below the waist, apart from a sock on her right foot, and with a deep ligature mark on her neck. It was shortly before 1 a.m. on February 7th, 2004, 5 days after she had walked away from her friend's house with her pink backpack, eager to get home for the Super Bowl. At 7:10 a.m., Sarasota County Sheriff Bill Balkwill appeared live on national television from the car wash parking lot. His voice breaking, he said, "The body of a beautiful 11-year-old girl, Carlie Brucia, has been found. Joseph Smith is under arrest for the abduction and murder of Carlie." The grief that followed was immediate and overwhelming. At Carlie's school outside her home, At a candlelight vigil at a local church, the community mourned the vivacious sixth grader. Friends placed flowers along the memorial at the car wash. Cadence Stauffer, Carlie's 11-year-old classmate, it was among dozens of children trying to make sense of something that adults themselves could not process. 12-year-old Sierra Bacara, who loved Carlie deeply, had postponed her own birthday party to wait until Carlie came home. When the news broke, she canceled it entirely. A child had canceled her birthday party for her friend, and then the friend never came home. That detail, small, private, utterly human, says more about who Carlie Brucia was and what her loss meant to those around her than any headline ever could. She was not a statistic. She was the reason a little girl canceled her party. She was the face on the television that a nation could not look away from. She was the voice in the school chorus that Sarasota would never hear again. And the man responsible was now in a jail cell, still, for the moment, silent. But the evidence was already speaking for him. By the morning of February 7th, 2004, Joseph Peter Smith was behind bars and Carlie Brucia had been found. The county sheriff had made the announcement on live television. The nation, which had spent 5 days watching and hoping, now exhaled, not with relief, but with the particular leaden grief that comes when the worst possible outcome is confirmed. The search was over. The trial had not yet begun. And between those two moments lay one of the most forensically overwhelming prosecutions the state of Florida had seen in years. A case built brick by brick from surveillance footage, DNA, hair fibers, encrypted letters, and the testimony of a man willing to stand up in court against his own brother. From the moment the car wash surveillance footage was released on February 3rd, investigators had been working at extraordinary speed. The video had done something rare in criminal cases. It gave them a face, not a description, not a composite sketch. An actual face captured on camera, committing the act. At least 2 informants called police after recognizing Smith from the television broadcasts of the security footage. The calls came from people who knew him, neighbors, acquaintances, members of the same social world he inhabited. His heavily tattooed arms, his mechanic's shirt, the name tag on his chest, all of it had been visible enough to identify him to people who had seen him in person. Smith was already in custody by February 3rd, having been arrested on an unrelated parole violation. When detectives connected the dots between the man in the footage and the man already sitting in their jail, the investigation shifted into high gear. After gaining consent to search his room and belongings, detectives found 2 gray mechanics uniforms with a yellow Joe name tag in his closet. Drug paraphernalia found in his car confirmed the parole violation that kept him detained. The borrowed yellow Buick became a treasure trove of forensic evidence. An FBI team supervisor testified at trial that a semen sample found on Carlie's shirt matched Smith's DNA profile at all 13 relevant locations on the DNA strand. The likelihood of randomly selecting a matching DNA profile from the general Caucasian male population was 1 in 32 quintillion. That number, 32 quintillion, is not a statistic that leaves room for reasonable doubt. It is, for all practical purposes, a certainty. An FBI hair and fiber analyst further testified that 2 head hairs recovered from the yellow station wagon were consistent with the victim's hair. 7 fibers removed from the vehicle were consistent with the fibers in the red shirt Carlie had been wearing on the day of her abduction and murder. The car that Smith had borrowed, driven, and returned in the early morning hours of February 2nd was, in forensic terms, a confession on wheels. For 2 days after his arrest, Smith refused to discuss Carlie. Investigators had the footage, the forensic material building in the lab, and the tips from the public. But they did not yet have a location. Carlie was still missing, and every hour that passed made the outcome increasingly grim. The breakthrough came not from interrogation, but from family. John Smith, Joseph's brother, eventually contacted investigators and revealed that Joseph had confessed to him, telling him that Carlie was in a field near a church on Proctor Road. It was an act of extraordinary moral weight. John Smith chose truth over loyalty, chose a dead child over a living brother, and in doing so, gave Carlie's family the only thing they had left to hold on to, the ability to bring her home. Smith refused to speak with investigators about the abduction until February 5th, when he revealed where he had hidden Carlie's body. Armed with that location, law enforcement moved immediately to the Central Church of Christ grounds on Proctor Road. Carlie was found in the early morning hours of February 7th, and Smith was formally charged shortly thereafter. On February 20th, 2004, Joseph Peter Smith was indicted on one count of first-degree murder. The charges of kidnapping and capital sexual battery were also filed by Sarasota County prosecutors. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, slowly, as they always do, but with the full weight of the evidence behind them. Before moving to the trial, it is necessary to acknowledge something that has never been fully resolved. Prior to Smith's arrest in the Brucia case, authorities had also investigated the possibility that he was behind the unsolved abduction and murder of 25-year-old Tara Riley, whose naked body was found behind a Walmart in Bradenton in 2000. Smith was never charged in connection with Riley's death, and that case remains officially unsolved. In 2021, John Smith, the same brother who testified against Joseph in the Brucia trial, said he would bet his life that his sibling was also responsible for Riley's death. It is a statement that carries enormous weight, coming from a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to tell the truth, even at devastating personal cost. But without a charge, without a conviction, Tara Riley's case remains open. Her family has never received the closure that, arguably, the evidence points toward. That injustice exists quietly alongside the Brucia case, a reminder that the damage done by men like Joseph Smith rarely has only one face. The trial of Joseph Peter Smith began on November 7, 2005 in Sarasota, more than a year and a half after Carlie's murder. The delay was not unusual for a capital case of this magnitude. Jury selection, pre-trial motions, and the sheer volume of forensic evidence to be organized and presented required extensive preparation on both sides. The prosecution's case was, by any measure, overwhelming. They presented the car wash surveillance footage, which the jury could watch for themselves. They presented the DNA evidence linking Smith to Carlie's clothing. They presented the hair and fiber analysis from the Buick. They presented the testimony of John Smith, who told the jury directly that his brother had confessed to having what he called rough sex with Carlie before killing her. Prosecutors also played taped jailhouse phone conversations in which Smith spoke of being on drugs while committing the crimes. And then there was the letter. An encrypted letter Smith had written to his brother from jail was intercepted by prison personnel. An FBI cryptanalyst testified at trial that the decoded message confirmed Smith had disposed of Carlie's backpack and clothes in 4 separate dumpsters, that he had dragged her body to where it was found, and that he had instructed his brother to destroy the letter after deciphering it. A man who writes encoded letters about hiding evidence from inside a prison cell is not a man whose innocence is in serious question. The defense, faced with this mountain, did not contest Smith's involvement. Instead, they argued that the act was not premeditated, that it was a drug-induced assault carried out by a man who had been attempting to overdose that same day. It was a strategy aimed not at acquittal, but at avoiding the death penalty, at convincing at least some jurors that what happened was the product of chemical annihilation rather than deliberate, cold-blooded planning. The jury was not persuaded on the broader question of guilt. On November 17, 2005, after approximately 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. Smith sat expressionless as each guilty verdict was read. He showed no visible emotion. His lawyers conferred quietly beside him. Across the courtroom, Carlie's mother, Susan, wept softly, with her head bowed. On her father, Joe, nodded, once firmly, at each of the 3 convictions as they were announced. The sentencing phase began on November 28, 2005. On December 1st, the jury returned with its recommendation. By a vote of 10-2, the jury recommended the death penalty. It was during the sentencing proceedings that Joseph Smith, for the first time, spoke publicly about what he had done. A weeping Smith addressed the court, telling Judge Andrew Owens that he had taken large amounts of cocaine and heroin on the day of the crime in hopes of killing himself. He said, "I do not ask for mercy for myself. The only thing I can see to give me a life sentence is for my family. I do not want to see them hurt any further." For Carlie's family, those words, whatever weight Smith may have intended them to carry, offered nothing. Carlie's aunt, Carlie Brucia, read a statement on behalf of Carlie's grandmother, Andrea, during the proceedings. The statement said, "Carlie's future and life have been stolen from her and from her family. We will never know her as a teenager." It continued, "Our family is forever broken. Our nightmares about what you've done to her. Our hearts will never heal." A teacher also addressed the court, noting that even as 8th graders, years after the murder, Carlie's friends continued to struggle academically and emotionally. The children who had known her, who had planned birthday parties with her and talked about sweet 16s with her, were still carrying the wound. They would carry it, in some form, for the rest of their lives. On March 15, 2006, Judge Andrew Owens formally sentenced Joseph Peter Smith to death by lethal injection for the first-degree murder of Carlie Jane Brucia. He was additionally sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment on the charges of capital sexual battery and kidnapping. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been delivered, but the story was far from over. The appeals would stretch on for years. The legal system would revisit this case again and again. And for Carlie's family, the verdict and the sentence were not an ending. They were simply the beginning of a long, exhausting wait for a closure that the law kept delaying. When a child is murdered, the death does not happen only once. It happens again at the funeral. It happens again at what would have been her 12th birthday, her 13th, her 16th. It happens at graduation she never attended, at weddings that were never planned, in the empty chair at every family table for every year that follows. The people left behind do not simply grieve and recover. They are permanently altered, reshaped by an absence so total, so violent, so unnecessary, that the rest of their lives become a navigation around it. This is what Joseph Peter Smith left behind when he took Carlie Jane Brucia on the evening of February 1st, 2004. Not just a dead child, a family fractured at the foundation, a community changed forever, and a nation forced once again to confront the question it never wants to answer. How does this keep happening? Of all the casualties in this case, perhaps the most quietly devastating is the fate of Carlie's mother, Susan Shorpen. Susan had been the parent who called 911 within 30 minutes of Carlie's disappearance. She had been the mother who stood before cameras and said, barely able to breathe, "We desperately need her. Please release Carlie. Please give me my baby." She had sat in that courtroom in November 2005 with her head bowed, weeping softly as the guilty verdicts were read. She had survived all of it: the search, the discovery, the trial, the sentencing, in the way that parents of murdered children survive, not intact, but upright. But the years after the verdict were brutal in ways the public did not always see. In July 2005, while the trial was still being prepared, Susan lost custody of her 7-year-old son after failing a drug test. At the time, she said she had turned to drugs because the pain within her reality was too much to bear. That statement, raw, unguarded, honest, is not the confession of a weak person. It is the statement of a mother who watched her daughter be taken from her by a stranger and who could not find any other way to silence what that knowledge felt like from the inside. Susan Shorpen did not live to see Joseph Smith's death. She died in 2017 of a suspected drug overdose. She was in her 40s. Friend and child advocate Judy Cornett, who had known Susan and followed the family's story, said at the time, Carlie's death was something impossible for Susan to recover from. This was clearly one of the biggest blows imaginable in her life. Susan Shorpen died 13 years after her daughter. She never fully left the car wash parking lot on Bee Ridge Road. In the most meaningful sense, she was still there, still waiting for Carlie to come home for every one of those 13 years. Carlie's father, Joe Brucia, took a different path through the same devastation, one characterized by anger, advocacy, and an unflinching willingness to hold institutions accountable for what he saw as their failure to protect his daughter. From the beginning, Joe had been vocal about the systemic breakdowns that allowed Joseph Smith to be free on the evening of February 1st, 2004. He told reporters, "I feel so let down by the system because Joseph Smith was on parole before he got to my daughter, and he was supposed to go back to jail for 5 years if he violated. He did violate. He was passed out with a bag of cocaine in a parking lot. Instead of giving the consequence they said they would, they gave him drug offender probation, which is just semantics, and that's why my daughter is not here today." That anger was not irrational. It was precise. It was documented. It was correct. The system had encountered Joseph Smith repeatedly and had repeatedly declined to remove him from society in any lasting way. Joe Brucia spent years naming that failure publicly, refusing to allow Carlie's death to be absorbed quietly into statistics. When Smith died in prison on July 26, 2021, Joe Brucia's reaction was not one of peace. He told Fox 13, "I feel wonderful. It's long overdue. The inept and corrupt criminal justice system could not get it done. So the natural order of things finally took care of it." It was not a statement of closure. It was the statement of a man who had spent 17 years watching an institution he deeply distrusted fail his daughter, and who felt no obligation to pretend otherwise when the man responsible finally died. his grief never left him. It simply hardened into something he could use. One of the most painful aspects of this case for Carlie's family was that the legal proceedings did not end with the 2006 sentencing. They continued for 15 more years, a relentless series of appeals and constitutional challenges that kept Joseph Smith's name in the news and kept Carlie's family tethered to a courtroom they had hoped to leave behind. In 2018, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a new sentencing hearing for Smith following the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Hurst v. Florida, which found that Florida's death penalty system was unconstitutional because it gave too much authority to judges rather than juries in imposing death sentences. Smith's non-unanimous jury recommendation, 10-2 in favor of death, fell under this constitutional scrutiny. Smith's death sentence was overturned in 2018, but the Florida Supreme Court reinstated it in April 2020. The legal back and forth was not abstract to Carlie's family. Every filing, every hearing, every ruling was another moment in which they were required to re-engage with the case, to remember, officially, publicly, what had been done to their child. In the end, none of it mattered in the way the courts intended. Joseph Peter Smith was found dead in his cell at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, on July 26, 2021, at the age of 55, while awaiting his execution. His cause of death was liver cancer. He did not face the lethal injection the jury had recommended. He died, as many people do, from the slow deterioration of his own body. Whether that constitutes justice is a question each person must answer for themselves. State Attorney Ed Brodsky issued a statement following Smith's death. While nothing can bring back Carlie, we are grateful that her family, her friends, and the entire Sarasota community will finally have closure and will not have to endure any further court proceedings to bring Smith to justice. Closure. It is a word that gets used often in cases like this. Whether it actually describes anything real, anything felt, anything healed, is another matter entirely. Carlie's death did not pass without generating legislative response. Carlie's Law was a bill introduced in the United States Congress by Representative Katherine Harris of Florida, with the support of Representatives Nick Lampson and Marcia Blackburn, in response to Carlie's kidnapping, rape, and murder. The amendment to existing law was intended to toughen parole rules for sex offenders. Partly for this reason, Joe Brucia approved making the law in Carlie's name, although he acknowledged that the law would not have applied to his daughter's specific case, since the charges for which Smith was on probation were not the sexual offenses the law would target. Ultimately, the bill failed to pass Congress and appears to have been abandoned. Carlie's name was attached to legislation that never became law. Her father knew it would not have saved her even if it had. And yet the effort was made, because when a child dies and the system that failed her remains unchanged, the only response available to the living is to try to change it anyway, even knowing the limitations of what law can accomplish. What the case did achieve in a broader sense was a renewed national conversation about how America monitors and manages individuals with violent criminal histories who are released on parole or probation. It raised questions about the adequacy of supervision, about the consequences, or lack thereof, for repeated violations, and about who bears the cost when the system fails. Those conversations did not produce perfect solutions. They rarely do. But they happened because Carlie happened. Because a nation watched 71 seconds of footage and could not look away. A teacher who addressed the court during Smith's sentencing noted that even as 8th graders, years after the murder, Carlie's friends continued to struggle academically and emotionally. Those children, who were 11 and 12 years old when their classmate was taken, grew up carrying something most adults never have to carry. They learned, at an age when the world is supposed to feel safe and infinite, that it is neither. Sierra Baccarat, the girl who canceled her 12th birthday party to wait for Carlie to come home, grew up. Samantha Riley, who had talked with Carlie about their sweet 16s just days before the abduction, grew up. Cadence Stauffer, who told reporters she thought Carlie must have been threatened, she grew up too. All of them carrying, up in some private interior space, the memory of a girl who loved Jennifer Lopez and pizza and singing in the school chorus, and who never made it home for the Super Bowl. That is the true measure of what was lost, not in headlines or verdicts or legislation, in the lives of the people who loved her, quietly and permanently altered. The Carlie Brucia case is not simply a story about one man's violence and one child's death. It is a story about systems, about the gaps between what institutions promise and what they deliver. Joseph Smith had been arrested at least 13 times before he encountered Carlie. He had been previously charged with kidnapping. He had been found in violation of his parole. At each juncture, the system had an opportunity to intervene more decisively. At each juncture, it did not. And it is also a story about addiction, about what happens when a person's capacity for self-regulation is so thoroughly destroyed by substance dependency that the most basic moral constraints no longer function as barriers. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and explanations matter, not because they reduce responsibility, but because they point toward prevention. If addiction is a public health crisis, and the evidence is overwhelming that it is, then the failure to treat it is not merely a personal tragedy. It is, as this case demonstrates, a public safety failure with consequences that extend far beyond the addict. And it is a story about a little girl who deserved 40, 50, 60 more years of ordinary life, who deserved to have her sweet 16, who deserved to find out what kind of person she would become, who deserved, at the very minimum, to make it home for the Super Bowl. Her name was Carlie Jane Brucia. She was 11 years old, born on March 16, 1992, in Oyster Bay, New York, and raised in Sarasota, Florida. She was a Renaissance student. She sang in the school chorus. She wanted to be a pop star like Jennifer Lopez. She wore black when she felt like it, and pigtails when she didn't. She gave warm hugs to everyone she knew, and never badmouthed anyone in the hallways of her school. She had a little brother named Leaf, and a cat named Charlie, and a best friend who postponed her birthday party rather than celebrate without her. She talked about her sweet 16. She planned her future with the confidence of a child who has every reason to believe she will have one. She was taken from a car wash parking lot in 71 seconds. She was found 5 days later behind a church. She was gone at 11 years old before she ever got to find out who she was going to be. The world she left behind, her father, her friends, her classmates, her community, and a nation that watched her face on their television screens and could not forget it, has never quite been the same. Her name was Carlie Jane Brucia. She deserved every single year she did not get, and the world is immeasurably less bright without her in it.